Hi, I'm John Vanderloop Drummond, editor of International Employment Lawyer, and thank you for joining today's webinar on what employers need to know about artificial intelligence in the workplace. The idea that robots are coming to replace human workers is not a new one, but there are increasing concerns over AI's role in monitoring, managing, and disciplining human workers. We're going to discuss all that and more today, but before we get started, there are a few housekeeping points to cover. First, please use the online question tool to post any questions you might have, and we will share them with speakers. Second, if you have any audio-visual problems during the presentation, again, please use the online question tool and a member of our team will be on hand to support you. Finally, just to note that today's session is being recorded and we will share a copy of the recording via email and on IEL's website in the coming days. With that being said, it's my pleasure to welcome today's panelists. First, we have Jan-Uwe Becker, who is a partner at Vanguard Littler in Hamburg. He advises companies on national and international employment and labour law with a focus on corporate organisation, restructuring and corporate transactions. He also advises on labour relation matters and negotiations with group, company and local works councils, has an industry focus on technology, media, entertainment, and is also an advisor on numerous venture capital funded companies. Jan is a member of the practice groups focusing on newly emerging legal playing fields like robotics, artificial intelligence and automation, as well as human rights and corporate social responsibility. He litigates high-profile cases up to the Federal Employment Court and the European Court of Justice. Next, we have Atlanta-based Littler shareholder Charlotte Main, who is one of the leaders in the firm's award-winning on-demand and case-smart platforms. She engages in targeted business development initiatives on behalf of the firm, based on market demand and insights garnered from firm and third-party data. Charlotte has met with more than 200 employers to introduce Littler's technology-based service solutions, providing her with a unique perspective on the technology and data resources being used by corporate legal departments. She is a frequent speaker at industry-wide conferences on several topics, including legal innovation, applying data-driven processes on legal operations, leveraging legal operations and technology to create efficiencies, and workplace issues that employers across the world are facing as a result of the pandemic. And last but not least, we have GQ Littler's Rahul Parekh from London, who works across all areas of employment law, including advisory, litigation, and transactional support, but with a particular focus on assisting international clients with their UK and EMEA employment law challenges. He has significant experience in employment tribunal litigation, as well as high court employee competition matters. He is also experienced in day-to-day HR support, including dealing with employee grievances and consultation processes, terminations, and drafting contracts and policies. He acts for several professional employee organisations, advising them on their UK and international employment compliance strategy and other issues. A warm welcome to you all. Now, Charlotte, assuming we can hear you, because I'm hoping that's now working.
I believe it is, yeah.
Great, okay. So to give some context to our discussion, what are the most common uses you're seeing of AI in the United States and the benefits they're bringing to business?
Yeah, so in the United States, I mean, AI is increasingly being used really throughout the entire employment life cycle. From the very beginning in recruiting and identifying candidates, we see AI tools that are doing things like crawling public, social media and public profiles to identify candidates who might be of particular interest to a company. From there, we see AI tools and full platforms that will, advertise particular positions to particular candidates based on their public profiles and information. From there, we see AI tools for sorting resumes and CVs, looking at qualifications and experience and matching those qualifications and experiences to particular positions. We see things like chatbots engaging candidates, asking them questions about their availability, their interest, their particular skill sets, really engaging directly in conversations with AI that feel like conversations with real people. We see tools that companies are using to analyze writing samples, looking for particular sort of linguistic analysis of, is this person, it's more than, is this person a good writer? It's what type of writer and what does their writing tell us about them? AI during the interview processes. Lots of news and headlines here in the States about particular companies offering video platforms for where candidates can go in and answer questions, save their video of them answering questions up to the company's database, and then that platform using AI to crawl those videos to make selections among candidates or to prioritize candidates, and then all the way into the actual life cycle of employment once you are employed. tracking our employees for when are they logging on to this system, when are they logging off of that system, when are they entering the building or moving within the actual physical structure when we're actually back at work and we're outside of our home offices. But essentially, there's just AI throughout the entire life of employment, for everything from hiring to performance management.
Jan, Raul, are you seeing similar uses and benefits of AI in the UK and Germany, or are there any other examples you could offer?
Yeah, so I think German employers in general are from a tendency a little bit more cautious when it comes to using such new technologies. This is also a matter of cultural and historical background in Germany, and we're quite sensitive when it comes to potential surveillance, data privacy issues, and therefore I would say from a German employer's perspective, it's not yet a common part of daily HR work. But however, and also, just being mindful of the last year where we've seen, surprising increase of using of IT technology also in the workplace simply due to the pandemic situation, we can also see employers more exploring these options. And in addition to that, it's definitely on the regulators' agenda because we have just last week adopted the new Works Council Strengthening Act, whereby now German Works Council, so the quite unique level of employee representation in Germany, they have now specific rights explicitly dedicated to artificial intelligence. So I can back all the examples Charlotte gave. Perhaps in addition to that, there are some compliance screenings happening with technology, like freelance screenings or pay equity screenings, and the selection processes in the context of reorganization.
Raul, what about you?
Well, I think my colleagues have left me relatively few examples still around, but certainly both of their experiences or the sort of use cases hit home for the UK. Less so the sort of cultural nervousness that Jan mentioned, which I think is quite German specific. A couple of other examples might be the use of AI loss prevention tools to prevent, for example, the loss of confidential information. So some vendors will offer really quite sophisticated language analysis tools that monitor the increasing body of online communications that happen while employees are at work, to detect, for example, something as subtle as a shift in tone, and then of course anything more blatant like an enormous downloading of information. Similar but related is monitoring for misconduct such as harassment, so-called Me Too bots, and identifying misuse of technology by picking up on keywords. And related to that, we've seen tools that help employees raise concerns anonymously if they wish to do so, so providing a way to air concerns, which is probably more simple technology than AI, but I think AI helps to sort of surface and encourage use of those tools.
Okay,
just to add, sort of wrapping back to the other part of your question, what are the benefits? I mean, I think ultimately for all of the examples that we've provided, it just fundamentally comes down to computers can do things with data at scale that humans cannot. So we're still doing the same things that we used to do, tracking, paying attention, looking for solutions. We just have tools now in the form of supercomputing and data that we didn't have before.
I guess, of course, along with those new tools, there are going to be question marks as to how they're used, and if there are any hotspots, particular areas of risk that employers should be aware when utilising them. For example, discrimination. Raul, do you have your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely the potential for that, John. I think to some extent that is it's naive to expect otherwise, because what we're doing here is using AI to, by and large, take the place of humans in functions that they have performed for decades, and that they have occasionally generated discrimination risks in performing. We've had decades of defending employers or bringing claims against employers because their employees have discriminated. It would be frankly a miracle if AI was, completely clean in a way that people cannot be. But the main risks are, first of all, direct discrimination in the European framing. So where an AI tool, for example, it is deliberately coded to discriminate against a particular group, which I think we'd all agree would be unusual, or perhaps more plausibly, an AI-based tool erroneously identifies a sort of correlation between factors and uses that then to make decisions on. So, for example, noticing that a correlation, exacerbating a trend in society, like more men having STEM qualifications than women, and therefore preferring men for STEM roles, would be a basic example. And again, that is clearly pernicious, clearly something we want to eliminate. Also, very clearly something that is a problem for humans. We also have indirect discrimination, which is, of course, where it's, for example, an algorithm is trained on a data set that places certain protected group at a disadvantage. And that can be quite difficult with AI because there's often this sort of black box at the center of it, which makes it difficult to defend a claim if it's brought. And then just finally, particularly in the UK, we're alive to the risk of failure to make reasonable adjustments or reasonable accommodations in the US parlance. So the disability discrimination risk, because again, these are very sort of sensitive, fact-specific things that depend on a sort of bespoke analysis that often AI is not best placed to offer.
So with those three prongs of potential risk, what are the best ways of managing those issues?
Yeah, so I think with direct discrimination, I mean, it's easy to say check the code and check the data set, but sometimes that code and that data set is not available to you as a purchaser of these services. But if you can do that, or if you can obtain assurances that it's been done, that's helpful. And making sure that discrimination doesn't creep in over time or with machine learning in the way that I described. With indirect discrimination, I think to be alive to that, you really need to be conducting some sort of audits or checks on the results that you're getting from your AI system. And frankly, that's something that, again, I keep going back to this comparison with the sort of human alternative. That's something you should be doing today if you're not using AI in your recruitment process. So that's not some additional compliance step you need to take. It's just sort of best practice anyway. But also with AI, something you might want to think about is transparency. How can you, when setting up a system like this, communicate with employees and help them to understand more about what the system is going to do, rather than just doing what I think a lot of organizations do, which is just sort of saying the computer will decide this, or the algorithm is deciding, without any explanation of how it's deciding or what it's doing. And I think that creates a sort of natural sense of suspicion. And then when it comes to failure of reasonable adjustments, I think there's a need to sort of to really check up front and give disabled customers or employees, whoever they are being subjected to this algorithm, an opportunity to raise a red flag and for a more personal analysis to be made of their needs.
That makes sense. Charlotte, aside from discrimination, what kind of legal risks would you highlight for employers using AI?
Yeah, I mean, picking up on what Rahul said, it's really the idea that the human isn't completely eliminated. That the human is, purchasing from a vendor a tool, software, whatever it is, that has an AI component in it, and that AI component is often machine learning, and all sorts of promises are made sort of in that sales cycle. This is what it's going to do for you. It's going to make your life easier. It's going to process things faster. The human still plays a role, both in the purchasing as well as in the building and development. And so in addition to the risks of discrimination that are inherent in human involvement in the tool, if we're teaching the tool what we know, we're creating risk for ourselves for discrimination claims, as Rahul mentioned. But the other just fundamental risk is it doesn't work. It doesn't deliver the results that were promised, or it makes things more complicated, or even worse, not only does it not deliver the results that were promised, it delivers worse results than you had when you started. So a lot of people, a lot of companies are turning to AI-based tools to eliminate bias in the workplace. That's often part of what the value proposition that the vendor brings is we can help limit your employment discrimination risk because this tool will help eliminate discrimination in the workplace or help catch issues of discrimination in the workplace. But if that tool is not properly calibrated, if it's learning lessons that are, perhaps unintended lessons as it keeps doing what it's doing, you could end up with an even worse result than you had before. And the challenge here is just there's a lot of money to be made. I mean, this is sort of a pioneering area. Big data is exciting to businesses, and HR and employment is part of the business. And so this sort of evolution of big data and big data based tools into HR and employment decision making it can be challenging. I mean, are you getting a return on your investment that's worth it is really one of the risks. The other risk, which I think that Jan will address in greater detail, is just information security. I mean, we have big data now. We're capturing so much about ourselves. Even more so through the pandemic and the lockdown. We now know, who attended what meeting. We have data from our Zoom platforms or our Microsoft meeting platform, meetings platforms of who attended and when, and were they chatting or were they not chatting, and were they sharing their screen or not sharing their screen. Just all of the data that we have is living somewhere within the organization. And at the same time, the risk of breach it's significant, it's real. Littler's Chief Information Security Officer reminds us, at least once a quarter that, there are companies who have had breaches, and then there are companies who will have breaches. There's no perfect solution. And so that risk of just being sure that if we're going to capture all of this and now use tools to capture even more, that there are proper security measures around all of that. So beyond the discrimination risk is just the fundamental privacy and breach risk.
Could there be any other unintended consequences from deploying machine learning in the workplace? Well, it's something that you may have seen or thought about.
Yeah, so I think there are clearly potential for unintended consequences. I mean, just in the UK context in particular, what we often worry about when looking at these sort of novel, I was going to say novel technologies, but it's actually novel situations, is a breach of trust and confidence. So the implied term that employers and employees have to not to act in a way that's going to destroy trust and confidence. And the risk there is that you do something like set out this fancy new system that you've bought from a silver-tongued vendor, and then it malfunctions or operates badly in some way that creates this constructive dismissal risk across your workforce. And there are some slightly unhelpful for employers decisions about the obligations to make lawful, rational decisions in good faith and so on. But the other risk, of course, is data privacy. And I think people are very, ever since the sort of great GDPR moral panic, people are highly alert to this in Europe, even more so than they were beforehand. And so they're alert to it, but they're not necessarily informed about it. So you often find, as an employer trying to do something that's a little bit out of the ordinary, you will be met with lots of opposition from your employees, some of which needs to be is not entirely sort of founded and needs to be worked through, and some of which is reasonable because there are compliance steps that you need to take. There are information security measures that you absolutely should be undertaking, as Charlotte mentioned. But that data privacy issue can create a very real compliance risk and reputational risk to organizations trying to do something a little beyond the ordinary, trying to push the envelope.
Okay. Before we go on to Jan, talk a little bit more about what's going on in Europe. Charlotte, any headline-grabbing cases that in the US that kind of demonstrate the sorts of things we talked about, to give some more context to the discussion? Sorry, Charlotte, I think your mic's...
Sorry, my bad. I apologize. Yeah, so no headline grabbing cases as of yet, but we certainly have lots of headlines. I mean, the headlines are really direct to what Raul was just saying about, reputational risk. I mean, we're all, I think, probably familiar, or at least have heard the story of, Amazon's tool that they built and ultimately abandoned, rightfully so, because whether not intentionally, the tool was disfavoring CVs and resumes that involved the word women's. So if you went to a women's college or if you participated in women's sports, that didn't match the algorithm of what a successful candidate or a successful employee matched, and so you ended up with a result that was, not intended. We hear stories and headlines about sort of the bizarre results of, machine learning AI tools that ultimately came to the conclusion that the two key markers of success for an employee within a particular company was if your name was Jared and you played lacrosse when you were a child. Not exactly what the client or the employer intended or wanted, but those sorts of headlines or stories, I think it causes reputational harm potentially. But it causes us all to be a little dubious about, what do these tools do and how do they really work? And as a result of that sort of circumspect look at it, we're starting to see the path toward the headline grabbing cases. So in the states, the federal agency, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, in their annual report acknowledged that they have conducted 2 investigations involving AI tools and hiring. That's groundbreaking. Maybe not headline making for the public, but groundbreaking for employment lawyers. When the federal government is essentially sending a signal to employers that if you are using these tools, you will be held accountable for the outcome of the use of those tools. And we saw in 2018, even under the prior administration, we saw 3 US senators asking the EEOC to specifically develop guidelines for employers, outlining what employer liability is and what it looks like. They sent a letter. It's not law yet, so we don't have a basis yet for those lawsuits. But one of the 3 senators who sent that letter is now Vice President Kamala Harris. So there is sort of a momentum behind building a foundation for legal analysis or legal risk in those headline grabbing cases. There are some other states, not the federal government, the full United States, but individual states that are building their own patchworks of individual laws, and we can talk about those in a moment when we start talking, a little bit more about specific areas of legislation. But in states that are large states, in that they have big populations and are the home of big employers with thousands, tens of thousands of employees, Illinois, New York, New Jersey, Texas, and California, are definitely paying attention, introducing legislation, and that conversation has started that will eventually give us the foundation for litigation that will come. That's what we do here. We litigate a lot.
Well, turning from the US to Europe, Jan, what cases have you seen that perhaps involved AI-based employee dismissal or discipline? How common is that in your view?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say it's common so far for other reasons. So it's not that employers are not using that technology. Basically, we can see employers trying to streamline their dismissal procedures with that. I've seen one example of an employer trying to operate his performance management system by technology. Basically, if a specific employee missed his targets for a specific period, then the system automatically imposed a performance improvement plan, then basically also monitoring that plan, and then ultimately leading to the suggestion that the employee shall be dismissed based on continued underperformance. However, the European GDPR regulation still says that even though there is support by technology, the ultimate decision must still be done by a human. And so anything against it or going away from that type of procedure would be already in violation of GDPR rules. And Raul just mentioned this was a big exercise for companies, so they are very cautious about that. And in addition to that, we can see that also other areas of law are simply limiting the ultimate use of AI, basically replacing the human by 100%. For instance, in Germany, any kind of termination is still a declaration of intent, and that requires a human act. Yes, can only be done. The company can only be represented by an individual being. In addition to that, we have form requirements like, termination must be done in writing, meaning with wet ink signature. And so in the end, there will be a supportive role of the system. But so far, and given current regulations, there is also a limit to it. However, I would say AI is not a common tool in disciplinary and termination processes, but it becomes much more relevant and will become, I think, in the next years. Yeah.
We've skirted around the topic of data protection a little bit, but let's dive in properly. So really, how is it key and how does it affect things? Raoul, you want to start, and then Jan, you want to follow on with some thoughts?
Yeah, sure. I mean, everything that I'm about to say, I think, will be very familiar to people who've worked through data protection compliance in other areas, with one exception that Jan's already mentioned about GDPR's prohibition on fully automated decision making. The principles that you need to apply in relation to an AI system are the same as for, something more basic like a diversity monitoring platform. First of all, you need to make sure that you've got a lawful grounds for the data processing. And that may be more or less difficult depending on how sort of obvious the benefits of the AI system are. You secondly need to think about transparency rights, about informing employees or subjects of the processing that you're undertaking. Again, that shouldn't be terribly difficult because you will already be providing employees with some information about what you're doing with your data and your privacy notice. So it's not like you're going to have to be kicking off some enormous notification system. You'll probably be amending a document that already exists. But it does lead on to one of the points that we've touched on a couple of times already, which is you'll want to be transparent about what you're doing with AI, not just for compliance with GDPR, but because you will need to combat some sort of natural suspicion to these systems. And the way not to do that is to implement them in secret and not explain properly what they are or what they're for. So I think actually the GDPR transparency obligation provides a sort of moment and an opportunity to do something that you should be doing anyway. And then just moving on to the prohibition on fully automated decision making. I mean, strictly speaking, I suppose that's the wrong way to put it. It's not a prohibition, but it's a right for that decision to be subject to human review. But what that can result in practice is there's no point having the decision made by automated means, because if anyone doesn't like the decision, they're going to ask for a human review. So you might as well just have it done by a human first of all. And I think actually that's already impacting how companies are choosing to use AI and how they are reserving sort of important, potentially adverse decisions to humans. I mean, whether that is a good or a bad or a proportionate thing is a question for another day, but it's something that you need to think about if you're an employer in this area. And then finally, just a slightly more fundamental point on data processing that you should always think about is whether you are going to be a processor or a controller under the legislation, because that will affect the extent of your obligations. I would think that most employers are going to be controllers of their employee data, but some of the vendors might try to get through as processors. And as an employer, you need to think about whether you're okay with that or not, or whether that really reflects what they're doing, especially if you don't have a good understanding of or control of what they're doing with the data.
Yeah.
Yeah, in addition to what Raoul just mentioned, basically data is of course the fuel of the whole artificial intelligence. The system cannot live without data, and I think also Charlotte mentioned it. Data security, data privacy is one of the main concerns we can see in relation to the use of artificial intelligence. I think in addition to what we just heard, also the transfer of the data among, for instance, group companies will become very relevant, because it's very unlikely that, for instance, a German subsidiary introduces such a system and we have a US parent. They will likely want to share the data, and also to conduct, in the good or in the bad way, checks about the data collected. And so you must make sure that you have the proper confidentiality agreements, data transfer agreements in place. You need to be, cautious about certifications, audits, etc. And another dimension that plays into that area is basically that AI systems will very likely not be on premise. So it will be not on your own server store. It will be always a third-party vendor. And Charlotte mentioned at the beginning, is this a trustworthy vendor? You can see, do they actually comply with all the data privacy aspects to it? And especially, very likely it's not, within the own country. So it will always have a very international dimension to that. Just say, like Raul already outlined, basically all the fundamental principles of data protection, lawfulness, processing in good faith, transparency, which I already heard, and data minimization and accuracy and storage limitation. This must all, of course, be considered with that. And basically, the European Commission has identified that AI needs a very immediate action on all these issues. So we can expect really new legislation coming in from the regulators on the European level.
That segues really well into my next point, which is, obviously the EU is looking very closely at this. Could you give us a little overview of the proposed regulations as they stand?
Yeah, sure, of course. So we all thought, GDPR is done, now we are set for the future, but it's not the fact. So the EU Commission is currently pushing for an artificial intelligence regulation, which will be a regulation, not a directive. Yeah, so this means it will have immediate impact on the national level as well, and this could become really a game changer for the regulation of AI. And I think, from my own European perspective, German perspective, this is the most comprehensive framework we can see around the world so far. And again, this will be in line with what we can see on whistleblowing protection, where new directives are introduced, where we have supply chain directives coming in. We have now also a very early law regulating AI. And the purpose of that new artificial intelligence regulation is to provide for quite uniform legal framework within Europe for the use of that. And basically, what the European Commission does is they divide AI systems in different categories. So there will be some systems will be absolutely banned from the European markets. Yeah, so where we have a significant level of privacy protection. And then there are high risk, limited risk, minimal risk systems, and depending on that assessment, different rules will apply. And the higher the risk, basically, of course, the stricter the rules will be. And the proposed regulation says all what is relating to employment, workers management, whatever all the use cases we already discussed, this will be deemed as a high risk system. Because all those systems will basically or can impact your future career prospects, your livelihoods, your income, and therefore they say this is an area where we apply systems and has an immediate impact on the life of others. And basically what the regulation is proposing is, so before you can introduce that kind of system, you need to run through what we call ex-ante third-party conformity assessment. Sounds very technical, but basically it will include that the system will be reviewed, and not only on a high level basis, but really in-depth reviewed, also going to the algorithms. And we have seen other European countries already pushing for that, and I think we'll also talk about it later. So there we need to show all the fundamental things we just discussed. So do we meet the requirements for data quality? Do we meet the documentation requirements, traceability, transparency? Is there especially human oversight guaranteed? And how robust is that system? And of course, being on the spearhead of that development, EU is already very early in that process. And yeah, it's we'll see how it what will happen, but nevertheless, that's basically already coming up and can be seen on the European regulation level. Yeah.
I mean, do you think that it will be implemented as is? Would you think there'll be changes, or when do you think this will come to fruition?
Yeah. So we are in the early stages of that, but if you do some Google background search on that, you can find that it's on the top of the agenda of the EU Commission, and all the officials state that AI technology needs regulation now, with an emphasis on now, because I think what they believe is once the systems are there, once they are in place, it will be very difficult to regulate it then. Yeah, and so they would like to have the framework in place before the whole systems are up and running. I think we already learned that we can see they are developing, but they are not fully operative. They have not, they are not part of our daily lives so far, only in some aspects perhaps. And so they would like to come early in with that implementation. But I'm not sure if the current draft will actually be the one implemented. So currently there's a very long consultation process. Stakeholders have the opportunity to comment, and I think it's very important that the EU listens to those stakeholders very carefully, because we are not living on an island. We are embedded in the global world, and so it's important that the EU Commission listens to the companies and the global groups, and of course the social partners and governments before they do it. And it can very well take years from today until this has been adapted. And to a certain extent, it will be GDPR 2.0, let's say, yeah. But definitely, what I can assure you is, there are national, regulations already in place. I just mentioned at the beginning the German new law on the Works Council requirements, and the Works Councils in Germany now have already a dedicated right on artificial intelligence. So a country like Germany will definitely push for some kind of regulation also in the future. And I would be surprised if in the end there would be no regulation.
And talking about at the state level, what other legislation is in place, whether it is Germany or Spain, for example, where there's already something on the ground around AI regulation?
Yeah, so in Germany, last Friday, the law, which we call the Works Council Strengthening Act, which has been, basically a result of the pandemic to a certain extent as well. And they have now dedicated rights on the use of artificial intelligence. The law is pretty old, so including that in the law is a game changer already. Yeah, and the Works Council have now a dedicated right to consult with AI experts. They must be involved in the planning of the processes, of the procedures already at an early stage. So there can't be a company simply introducing something in Germany. Once you have a Works Council, you need to discuss that. And especially the law also refers to the guidelines of personnel selection in any way. So candidate selection on the positive side, we would like to recruit new ones, but also the ones to be let go. And so there's a quite, complete protection in place already in Germany, at least for the companies having the Works Council. And what's even more stunning, to be honest, is what is just happening in Spain. So the Spanish government just negotiated an agreement with the social partners, coming from a very different angle. Basically, where this all came from was resulting from a case in the gig economy. So riders were deemed employees. But as a side note, and this is even more relevant, sorry, my Siri is starting to talking about AI. Coming from that, what is even more stunning is that they included another right of social partners to have access to algorithm transparency. So this means, how do I get, in the case in Spain, how do I get a ride? How do I get a new assignment? This has, been a closed shop so far, but now you must open up the algorithm use, and that new level of transparency is quite unique from my perspective, and will require changes of the worker statute in Spain, and it will of course not be limited to riders. So any kind of platform workers will enjoy those rights. Nevertheless, of course, the purpose is to neutralize, let's say, biased punishments coming from the use of technology. And also, the Spanish legislation has been, proposed to the European Commission as being part of the recovery and resilience plan going forward for the digital future in Europe. So not only will we have a regulation on AI in general, but also, we must open up our books, how we use that and what kinds of system do we use. But nevertheless, if you look at the European level and what principles we all have, it's basically fully in line with that. So the EU fundamental rights, they refer to discrimination, so meaning protection from discrimination. They are referring to right of workers, to right of information, and of course to improved working conditions. And all of this is coming now. If a computer decides what assignment I get or I don't get, then basically I must understand that. Before that, it was a human being that I could talk to. Now I need to basically understand the machine doing that.
Of course, in relation to these proposed EU rules, one of the big elephants in the room is Brexit. So, Robert, how does that change how AI may be regulated in the UK, for example?
Yeah, so I think it sort of does and doesn't, in that, yes, new EU regulation won't directly bind companies in the UK, but it's quite, these products tend to be global or at least regional in nature. So, and the UK is, compared to the EU, a small market. So it's unlikely that vendors are going to be designing products that make use of some greater freedom in the UK compared to the EU. So my expectation is that there'll be an indirect regulatory impact of everything that Jan's just been talking about on the UK, irrespective of Brexit.
Okay. And looking over maybe to the US, Charlotte, any legislative or regulatory moves that you can see forthcoming or maybe are slightly in the pipeline?
Yeah, there are some. We are very far behind the EU. Obviously, GDPR puts you millennia ahead of us in terms of data protection and employee rights. But states are trying to catch up. Illinois, a large state, a large employer, has a new law effective in January 2020 regulating the use of video interviews and then AI to crawl and pull conclusions from those interviews. It's very similar. The law's ultimate goal is very similar to what Raul was describing about notice to the employee or the applicant, consent, and an understanding of how it's going to be used. And then also the right of the applicant or the employee to demand that the video be destroyed upon request, that the information not be kept about them. Sort of following that's one small state and a bunch of states, but sort of following that line of protecting the employee and giving the employee rights. And then New York is doing something similar to what Jan was mentioning, which is really the idea of regulating the algorithms themselves. In New York, legislation has been proposed, not yet passed, but it would require basically algorithmic audits before you could implement an AI tool that uses an algorithm. The tool itself and the algorithm specifically has to be audited for validation and compliance with New York's anti-discrimination laws. So basically the vendor or the tool developer has to prove upfront that the way the tool is used will not result in either intentional or unintentional discrimination. And those two themes seem to sort of, it's one or the other, sometimes both states are playing with that. And then at the federal level, in 2019, we saw the introduction, not yet passed, still proposed, but the introduction of the Algorithmic Accountability Act, the AAA. It's a little more vague. This is one of those US laws where we want a law that will regulate the use of algorithms, and essentially it would task the Federal Trade Commission with developing regulations that businesses would have to follow if they were going to use AI. The focus there is accuracy, so validation, fairness and elimination of bias, privacy and security and consent. So wrapping up sort of both themes, the employee rights as well as validation, into one law. But it's still only proposed. We're still very far behind.
Well, anything to add from this side of the Atlantic?
Well, actually, surprisingly little activity, at least in the UK domestically, compared to what Charlotte's described. I mean, maybe that's because we already have GDPR, which is the kind of closest thing we have to specific AI legislation. There are some calls for legislation in this area, most notably from the TUC, the Trades Union Congress, a sort of employee-focused body who published an AI manifesto, which had some ideas in it, certainly, but I haven't seen much sort of political take-up of those ideas. And I think, frankly, we have had several bigger fish to fry with sort of Brexit, COVID-19, and no doubt some other something else on the horizon soon.
A question for all of you now, which is kind of a big one. If AI in workplace is inevitable and it's going to continue to grow, how can employers use it in an ethical way? If we go around for each of you, start with Raoul, then Charlotte, then Jan.
Yeah, so I think I'm going to return to a theme that I've mentioned a few times, which is the human element here. A lot of the time that's not optional, that's sort of compulsory anyway, because as we've been speaking about under GDPR, you have this right to review if you've been subject to automated decision making. But I think keeping that in mind and making sure that humans are front and center in the setup of the system and implementation of the system and monitoring of the system is what's vital to leverage the benefits of AI ethically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then picking up from there, I mean, what those humans can do, besides consciously owning, we are purchasing a product that we will use, is then validating it. That the idea of the algorithmic audit or the audit of the algorithm, I mean, is something that human resources or chief people officers or personnel, those are questions they can be asking and requirements that they can demand from vendors. If they are asking for it, then those who are seeking to capitalize and make profit off of big data with fancy tools, they'll have to deliver. I mean, ultimately, the customer is king.
Charlotte, I think Mike's gone again.
Charlotte, your mic is off. Okay, so
Jan, we hear one.
Yeah, yeah. Likely the AI system didn't like what Charlotte was saying about that, but nevertheless. So if you ask about ethical, what is ethical? I think, of course, this is always, a definition of our time. So what is ethical today may not be ethical tomorrow, and vice versa. So but from our today's perspective, I think what Raoul and Charlotte mentioned, I think this will be common ground across the globe, is to just not simply trust the system, but keep the human element to it. And also be careful of what you're buying. So because I think there will be plenty of companies promising something that you can do by artificial intelligence, but even we will have difficulties to understand the code. And I think this will be also a changer for the HR department. So what a HR business person is doing today will be, the job role will be different, because soon you will also be kind of data analyst and need to work with those systems. And I think if you would like to do it in an ethical way, then you need to really understand what the system does. And also do a kind of deep dive, so not just buy something, but understand what you're buying. And in addition to that, include the data, processing subject. So very likely in our example, the employees, either by involving the employee representatives or by having those right to transparency we just outlined. Perhaps not always to the extent that the Spanish regulation has now proposed it, 100% transparency, but being involved in that. And I think if we do it and then implement a good system of checks and balances on that, I think then those systems can be a great support for our work in future and can also assist with taking away human bias that we are not always doing consciously, and in approaching some aspects in our work life also in a more objective manner.
Conscious of the time, I'd like to open this conversation up to our viewers. So if you have any questions, please use the question function, which should be on your control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Send them through to me. I'll then read them to our panelists. Charlotte, if you're with us, the first question is for you. Are you with us, Charlotte? Yeah. Okay, I'll try another one, and we'll come back to Charlotte maybe. Jan, how high risk for foreign AI developers? How high is the risk for AI developers if they want to share their data and algorithm with the under proposed regulations?
Yeah, if I would be a company developing that, I would have a close look on the AI regulation, because under the current draft of the AI regulation, European regulators would have authority to demand access to business data, source code, algorithms. And of course, there will be kind of limit to that to a certain extent, but nevertheless, it will expose your intellectual property. Yeah, and in addition to that, under the Digital Markets Act, we can also see in the EU, there are so-called gatekeepers, very likely US companies, because they are developing those systems, they're spearhead on that, and they are required to share data and algorithms with European competitors. So this is, of course, truly an IP nightmare if you would like to develop something new and then you need to share your main secret with others. But nevertheless, the risk for foreign developers will be fairly high if we keep in mind what we've just seen in Spain, and if something close to it comes into stays in the EU regulation, then one of course we'll have to be very careful with that.
So next, given all that we've heard today about the legal risks, should employers even bother with AI? Is it worth it, the risk? Charlotte, can I come to you first, or are you still struggling?
Charlotte may have to mime her response.
Yeah, there's gremlins in the system today. Okay, Ra, why don't you start, and hopefully Charlotte might come back shortly.
Yeah, sure. So even though I have sort of volunteered to be on this AI webinar, I'm a little bit of an AI skeptic. And I think that it's the sort of big benefits of AI have been hyped for a long time by vendors and by other people, including employment lawyers. And actually, the sort of use cases today in the HR world and the employment law world are quite narrow. And as we've heard, there are some problems with it, so some risks, which perhaps are there however you choose to achieve your objectives, but are definitely have the potential to scale up with AI. So I think employers should be perhaps a little bit more cautious about the hype, about the vendor sales pitch, and just keep an eye on the human at the same time. But I don't want to be all King Canute about this. Ultimately, AI is coming, but I think it might just be a little bit further in the distance than some would have us believe.
I'm hearing that our tech team might have sorted out Charlotte's issues, so fingers crossed.
I'm back.
Yay! Okay.
Isn't technology wonderful?
Over to you. What do you think? Is it all worth it?
Oh, I think it's, I mean, for euphemism in the state, the horse is out of the barn. I mean, big data is part of how businesses operate now. The insights, the actionable intelligence, the things that big data shows us that we didn't previously see before. That whole aha moment has happened, and it's happened in business, and it will continue. I mean, we're tracking metrics and key performance indicators in ways that we never have before because we didn't have the ability to do it. And so AI as a tool in HR and human resource and employment issues is a natural extension of just that human discovery of what big data can do for us. And so to Raul's point, we have to be careful with it. We had the aha moment, we've turned the light bulb on, but now we have to be cautious and thoughtful in what we do. And we have GDPR in particular, and anti-discrimination laws. We have the foundation of regulations that will motivate us to be cautious. But ultimately, from a risk perspective, an exposure perspective, and just a good business and reputation perspective, we're going to use it. It's just really, how are we going to use it responsibly? It gives us great power, and with great power comes great responsibility.
Jan, what about you?
Yeah, let's play the devil's advocate here. So I'm a very tech-savvy person, and in general, I embrace all the new technology we can see. Honestly, also human beings do make mistakes, so we need to be careful with those as well. And artificial intelligence coming in also requires proper checks and balances that I just mentioned before. But it's a very powerful technology, and I think for employers it can always eliminate also mistakes done by humans. So I think there's definitely an upside, and you should care as an employer about it, not only to streamline your processes to save money, but also to improve the way how we operate and to minimize human mistakes, because we all do those. However, I think the approach of the EU in general, not perhaps the draft as we can see right now, but the idea behind it to regulate something at an early stage, to give some framework how we operate with those systems, being mindful of the power they have, not unleashing the full potential they have without control, but putting into a nice framework. That's I think a good way to address that technology, and then to be open and mindful to it. And I think the GDPR we have on the one side added with the a couple of years later, very likely with a new AI regulation, I think all this would provide for a fair framework, whatever it would look like in the future as well. But that set of regulations or comparable regulations, or what the national regulators do, I think that's a fair approach. And for companies, there will be plenty of use cases in future that will have a very fair approach on the labor market and the workplace we see. And this can definitely also be a positive impact on our life.
Mentioning the proposal again, it will give me a chance to go back to Charlotte on the question I couldn't ask her a minute ago, which was, could the proposal potentially be perceived negatively outside the EU, and what impact could they have on EU competitiveness from the view of the states?
I think from the view of the states, there's a recognition that if you're a global business, if you are doing business outside of the United States, GDPR is a very real thing that we had to get serious about, and we had to get serious about it quickly. We may have generally been a little slow on the uptake, and there certainly was a big rush among global businesses with a global footprint in the States to get up to speed and get into compliance. Having gotten over that initial hurdle, what happens next with GDPR and AI, whether it's part of GDPR or individual countries making individual rules, I think we've sort of been pushed through that initial challenge, just recognizing that data, information security, and individual employee rights are, although not formally recognized as much here, it's a part of doing business if you are a global employer or if you're a business with global aspirations. So I don't know that it's viewed negatively. It's viewed as it is. I mean, the EU is a huge market, and a huge market for both large companies, but also mid-sized companies. There's a lot of business in the United States that aren't the Fortune 500, that don't have necessarily tens and thousands of employees that are partnering with partners in Italy or in Spain or in the UK. And those smaller mid-sized businesses recognize that we have to do this. So I don't see it as a negative necessarily. I don't see that we see it as a negative. It's just part of what we have to do. And frankly, I think it will help us. I think it will help us in the long run, because eventually we will have to do something similar here in the States. It will not remain an unregulated, just a rodeo of data, unregulated as it is.
So that leads to our final question for the day, which is, if you could each give one piece of advice on the best practical use of AI in the workplace, what would it be? Raoul, let's start with you, and then we'll go to Jan and then Charlotte afterwards.
Yeah, I'll deal with this quite briefly as the clock runs down. But I'd say if there's one piece of advice that I'd give, it's know what you're buying, what's in the data set that the vendor is going to use, and what are there in your commitments. So it's not an obvious point for employment lawyers necessarily, but if a claim comes in because of the use of the system, who's going to be liable? Can you pass that on to the vendor, especially if you can't defend it yourself? Over to you, Jan.
Yeah, and I think adding to that, I think it's important that employers are more or less educated consumers when buying in artificial intelligence. So do a deep dive and spend some time educating your staff working on those projects, and then think before you act more as well. So basically provide for a framework before you start introducing that. As a lawyer, quite often we come into a project when everything else is already done. But here I think when it comes to artificial intelligence, also being mindful of all the risks coming in, and also to raise acceptance level by the workforce. Yeah. Put out a framework in advance and then approach it. And I think then it can be a really good addition to the humans we have in the workplace, either in HR departments or the employees that get support from the systems.
And then I'll just add on to that. Know what you're buying is absolutely right. Educate yourself as you are doing it, but also know that you as the purchaser are in control. You're the buyer. And these vendors, there are a lot of them. And the marketplace is active and dynamic. And so you can ask for things as opposed to just knowing or educating. As you educate yourself about what you want the tool to do for you and what you do not want it to do for you, and then ask and make that demand of the vendors. And if they don't have it yet, they listen to the market. They'll develop it.
And I think that is definitely all the time we have before the AI kicks us all off anyway. So my thanks to Rahul, Jan, Charlotte for taking the time to be with us today, and to everyone who's watched this session. Just a reminder, the webinar has been recorded and we'll be sharing the recording online in the coming days. Thanks for joining us. If you haven't, if this is your first interaction with IEL, please look at the website to see the content we've got up there. There's a lot we're producing about AI monitoring the workplace. So there's certainly stuff that can be added to this discussion. We hope you subscribe. Take care and goodbye.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye, Tom. Bye, everyone. Have a good day.